Good morning. I'm an economist, and I've spent a good part of my life examining the impacts of economic activity on the state of health. They are intimately related. We are living perhaps the most serious crisis in modern history, where instructions have been given through the WHO and other organizations to national governments to partially or totally close down their economy. And we have been presented with a justification. In other words, that the closing down of the national economy is required to ensure the battle against the coronavirus, namely through lockdown and so on. Let me examine with you some of the issues underlying the closing down of part of the global economy, which means trade, production, it means investment, a whole series of activities. It's unprecedented in world history. The economy, in a sense, is the reproduction of real life. Without economic activity, there's no consumption, there's no investment. People are not able to purchase the goods which are required for their subsistence. And what has happened with the implementation of these measures is that it has led to a process of global impoverishment. Global impoverishment in the sense that people have lost their jobs, they are no longer able to pay for their mortgages, they are indebted, and in some cases, particularly in developing countries, there's famine. And I can say with all certainty that the impacts of these measures have led to a dramatic loss of life, particularly in developing countries where a large sector of the labor force are engaged in the informal sector, they're self-employed, often they're immigrant workers, they have no place to go, and the closing down of the national economy is ultimately some form of economic harakiri. It's a suicidal endeavor. It has devastating impacts on our lives. And in the United States of America, unfortunately, it has become tied into election politics. On the one hand, Trump is calling for the resumption of economic activity, and I'm not a Trump fan, but ultimately I do support the notion that the economy has to be restored and that economic activity has to be full swing in support also of a health endeavor. Now, there are many lies. The important lie is that there's a hidden agenda. There are powerful groups in the financial establishment who want this lockdown to continue. Because the more it continues, the more they benefit from picking up the pieces of a bankrupt economy. In other words, what you do, you destroy the small and medium-sized enterprises. We are in an economic system which is dominated by large corporations. They're going to pick up the pieces. Bankruptcy is good for business because it enables them to consolidate. And there's a vast literature on this subject. But there's another agenda, and that comes from Big Pharma. In the wake of the lockdown, there is, and it's already at the stage of tests, a multi-billion-dollar vaccination program. They're already doing the tests, and what they want essentially is that populations in different countries of the world, ultimately, with the support of their governments and the World Health Organization, engage in or accept to be vaccinated. Now, there are many problems with vaccination, and there are dangers with vaccination. I won't enter the debate. But what I will mention is that there are several cures and remedies to coronavirus 19. And these are not being, in fact, even mentioned in the media reports. What we have are hypes, which often are presented by prominent scientists. But what is the ultimate truth? Anthony Fauci, who is the advisor to Donald Trump now with regard to the pandemic, has written in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's the most prestigious medical journal in the United States and even worldwide. And he has described the coronavirus as follows: the overall clinical consequences of COVID-19 may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal influenza, which has a case fatality rate of approximately 0.1%. Hear me. He says that the COVID-19 is comparable to influenza. And if you look at the World Health Organization, they say something similar. And I quote, the World Health Organization says, those who become infected generally experience mild illness and recover in about 2 weeks. Precise quotes would say, most commonly reported symptoms include fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, and most patients, 80%, experienced mild illness. That's a statement from the World Health Organization. Approximately 14% experienced severe disease and 5% were critically ill, etc. Now, one expects the broader public that the statements, the scientific statements which are made by the WHO and by Anthony Fauci, who is advisor to President Donald Trump, would actually be reflected in news reports, but they're not. And I quote, Anthony Fauci says that COVID-19 is 10 times more lethal than flu. He warns that coronavirus could kill 200,000 Americans. I'm quoting from mainstream media. So what he says in his peer-reviewed journal, which I trust is peer-reviewed, and what he says publicly on CNN is totally different. He is a liar when he says it's 10 times more lethal than flu, unless, of course, the media is distorting his statements. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. There are other dimensions to this crisis. It is fairly well established that the estimates of coronavirus, COVID-19, are totally unreliable. We've covered that in a previous program, but I think it's very important now because some of the medical doctors are speaking out. And what are they saying? They're saying that physicians who are there to establish the cause of death are being pressured into entering coronavirus 19 as the cause of death, when in fact they don't have any proof of the cause of death. So in other words, what the medical authorities are doing throughout the United States, I don't know where this comes from, they are in fact instructing the doctors to put COVID-19 as the cause of death. And then immediately that goes fly high, and then people say we're dying. You're not dying, it's simply because the doctors have been instructed to lie or they're being pressured by powerful people. Okay? That's, of course, very important. Now, I'll give you a quote from a prominent physician who's been involved in death certificates for more than 30 years. And she says, I quote, "Those inaccurate numbers are then accepted as factual information, even though much of it is false. So even before we heard of COVID, death certificates were based on assumptions and educated guesses that go unquestioned." And essentially what is happening now is that clinics are being pressured to add COVID virtually everywhere. And of course that pushes up the mortality attributable to the virus. And then if you're looking at, more specifically, at estimates of cases, they're totally unreliable. They take the presumed cases and then they add them to the confirmed cases. The presumed cases is simply a medical examination by a physician, says, oh, you have the symptoms. But the confirmed cases are not, they are not reliable either. So that the statistics which are being presented to the public in terms of extension of this virus, which according to Anthony Fauci is comparable to seasonal influenza, and I should say that seasonal influenza causes 650,000 deaths worldwide, and nobody seems to be worrying about it. But I think first the public has to be informed as to the figures, as to the nature of this virus. Consult the peer-reviewed report of Anthony Fauci, which is co-authored with Robert Redfield, who is the head of the CDC. But let me return to the economic dimensions. The global economy is ultimately, and national economies are the basis for sustaining human life. There may be, of course, there are inequalities, there are social inequalities. But what this closing down of the national economy is doing is denying people the right to employment. It is creating a wave of unemployment. It is particularly affecting people who don't have formal contracts with their employer, who are hired on a day-to-day basis. Again, in developing countries, we're dealing with a situation which is absolutely dramatic. In the United States, the richest country on earth, people are queuing up at the food banks. There's a shortage of food. And bear in mind, the structures of trade, container trade, are also affected. And we receive a lot of goods from China. And inasmuch as, Western countries are at odds with China, particularly the United States, this also has an impact. And ultimately, it is necessary to ask the important question, is it either or? And is it something we want to determine within the electoral process where the Dems are saying, oh, we must save the people who are now who are in their homes and make sure that they don't get the virus, okay? Or we look at the Trump side, we may agree or disagree with Donald Trump, but the restoration of the national economy is absolutely fundamental. And it is through the restoration of the national economy that you're also going to be able to build up the healthcare facilities as well. I must say that I'm shocked and surprised by the fact that the labor unions haven't reacted and said there's a right to work. People have the right to work. They have the right to work in their jobs. Many people who claim to be progressives are in fact pushing for the electoral platform of Joe Biden, which is to say we must come to the rescue of the people who might be infected by the virus. Going back to work is going to be an important transition in combating that virus. And of course, going back to work will require safeguards. Absolutely, it has to be organized. But people who believe that closing down a national economy is an instrument to achieving a public health objective are blatantly mistaken and use a common sense. I'm an economist, but anybody in first year in economics knows that if you close down an economy, it is an absolute disaster.
Now available from globalresearch.ca. The threat of nuclear war. The destabilization of foreign countries. The movement to resist this worldwide aggression. These are the topics addressed in The Globalization of War, America's Long War Against Humanity. Buy your copy today and discover what is being hailed as a must-read and diplomatic dynamite. Available now at globalresearch.ca or wherever fine books are sold.